word, the official welcome. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Hissy Event 2021, our first live session with special guest Sean Knickerbocker. Sean Knickerbocker, how are you today?
Doing all right. How you doing, Kevin?
Good, I'm doing all right. Thank you for joining us for our virtual event. As I started putting together this event, Sean, I'll be honest, your name was it came up right up on my list of people I should
Oh, wow.
investigate. Yes.
Very flattering.
Yeah, but for a couple reasons. Just going not too far back, but a little far back when we were both still living in Savannah. I remember that you were definitely one of the people that from our peer group in Savannah definitely saw out at conventions and self-publishing their work in mini comic form.
Yeah.
And so as such, like that's kind of what like where my mind went. I was like, who do I know that's been doing this kind of as far back? The other side of it is we're very lucky to have you in that you work for a printer as well, at a printer. And so you have a lot of really helpful insight, hopefully there. But Sean, we can tackle this any number of ways. I sent you earlier this morning a list of questions. We can go down that list. We can also do it a more discussion based, however you'd like to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we can just go down the list, and if we veer off somewhere, that's fine with me too.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So this first question is something I like to ask a majority of my my guests that come in, but I am always curious as to kind of everybody's comics origin story. What led them to comics? Like maybe it was a specific book that you read as a child that was like, oh, I want to do this, or was it just like talking to an artist at some point? What brought you to comics?
Well, I mean, like I feel like every cartoonist always like, well, I've always drawn, and I think that's true. Like from even when I was a little kid, I like to draw a lot. But like at a certain point, I really got into like film early on. Like I was like a really big Stanley Kubrick fan, and I loved the idea of like an auteur telling a story. So I kind of like fell in love with that notion. But as I learned more about film and even animation, I realized that like you had to work with other people. And like as a teenager, that just like I was like, I can't work with other people. Like I'm unbearable. And then I saw the movie American Splendor, and I was like, I'm like this guy, Harvey Pekar, and he only works with like one other person. I don't even have to work with one other person. I can kind of draw. I don't got to deal with anybody. So that was kind of like what kind of like hooked me in. And then like after that, like I got really into comics. I found like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and like that blew my mind. And then from there, like I would just go to the comic shop like once a month, and then just like buy anything that wasn't DC or Marvel. Because like I grew up with that stuff. I was like, yeah, that doesn't interest me. I want more of this like Harvey Pekar stuff. I want more of these like crotchety jerks like complaining about their shitty lives. So like I got really into like like Chester Brown and Joe Matt and like Julie Doucet and anyone kind of doing auto bio stuff. That was definitely my hook in, because as a teenager, I fancied myself an interesting person. I thought I had a life that would be interesting to share. I mean, not true, but it was a fun fantasy.
Yeah. Totally. So that's cool. And then you went on. You spent some time in Savannah. You took a couple classes at SCAD, right?
Yeah. I was a freshman at SCAD. I mean, I grew up like super poor, like so poor that even the most like predatory loan people wouldn't like give my parents money. So like I could go for a year, and that was it. And like during that time, like I kind of like made like a core group of people that were like my friends and peers. And from there, like everyone was like doing mini comics. So it was kind of like kind of like my way to kind of sneak into SCAD in a way. It was like I was part of this community where we're all kind of making stuff. So it was a way for me to engage with, you know, peers and kind of like
Mhm.
learn from one another and like collaborate without going to school.
Mhm.
And then eventually I ended up going to CCS. Um, you know, life goes in all sorts of directions.
Mhm. And
And it's sort of,
CCS is the Center for Cartoon Studies up in
yeah,
Vermont.
yeah. And I'd say they're very focused on like if you've definitely like resigned yourself to being like, I will never make money from this, and I don't expect to, and that's maybe a good spot for you. But you know, like, I don't know. But I enjoyed my time there
Mhm.
immensely, and that's where I got more into print production
Mhm.
stuff specifically. That kind of became my specialty once I moved to Vermont and went to Center for Cartoon Studies.
Yeah, yeah. Because I remember that you in that core group, like you, Andrew Greenstone and Alex Bullitt were constantly like screen printing and kind of working that angle with your comics, like
Yeah.
with like covers and everything like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's because like you know, like I mean, I was you know, I only got into like drawing comics for a few years, and like a lot of my peers have been drawing comics since they were like kids or whatever. So
Mhm.
like, you know, I think from a technical aspect, like you know, from like my cartooning chops just weren't there.
Mhm.
But I could kind of combat it a little bit by like printing something that looked really cool, and that's always kind of been like my defense is like, you know, like I might not be like the best cartoonist out there, but like if I work for you, like my files are always going to be good, it's always going to be on time, I'm always going to be flexible, right? It's like that triangle of like being good, nice, and fast. It's like I'm
Mhm.
not great, but I'm pretty nice, and like I can definitely hit the deadline. So like that's kind of been my area, and like the cartooning's good enough. Like I'm not, you know, I'm not like Michael DeForge or something, you know, but
Sure.
it gets the job done, you know, and that's
Mhm.
fine. Yeah.
Mhm. We're all on the road to improving. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Every day.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So cool. So from there, you were kind of screen printing, and then you were interested in the printing process kind of from early on.
Yeah.
Is that kind of helped you kind of get into your current job at the
Yeah.
printer?
Yeah, definitely. That's what, yeah, exactly. Like, so, you know, my first kind of like printing job was when I was in Vermont. I got a job at Staples to work in the copy center. And like you know, my grift was like, I'm a poor art school student. I shouldn't even be in art school. I'm too poor to even be here. But I can like print things for free because I work at Staples, and everyone here is kind of like they're not paying attention. Like, who cares if this kid's stealing hundreds of dollars of photocopies? Like, it's photocopies. Who gives a shit? So like that was like my grift. I was like, all right, I have access to these machines. I can do whatever I want. And then after a while, I got bored, you know, and I was just like, well, what can I actually really do? Like, how can I push these shitty copiers to make interesting things? And I started to play around with them a little bit more. And I would like read about them online and kind of see like what different things I could do to like make something interesting with them. And that really just like started to, you know, make the print nerd in me percolate. And you know, maybe after like 6 months or so, like I took a job working for like a local screen printer doing t-shirts. It was also just kind of like a jack of all trades print place. So I just learned so many different things. You know, I learned like sign making and offset printing, and you know, I learned the ins and outs of like digital printing, and I learned how to do like more poster type printing and just like all sorts of different types of things. And like I kind of like learned the element. So like as I was going to CCS to learn how to be a cartoonist, like I was also like at my job like learning all the different things you need to know to be a good printer. Just like basic principles of how to print an image, regardless of like what kind of printing you're doing. Um,
Yeah.
so that definitely started that path, and I learned a lot about pre-flight, and that was definitely something I in early after CCS, like that's kind of how I survived, was like printing for cartoonists. You know, at the time I was like contracting work out. I didn't even know what contracting was, but like that's what I was doing. But like essentially I was, working with publishers producing these small runs of digital books, and like kind of brainstorming with them to try and find the most cost-effective way to like make this work where they're like able to pay their artists and their print bill, which is more work than any printer should ever have to do. But like, I was young and didn't know, but it was good. It was all good information. It was really valuable, and I made a lot of really good connections. Like I printed the very first Simon Hanselman comic that like was ever produced in the United States. Like I printed all of those. I printed a ton of like Michael DeForge stuff. You know, I worked with like a lot of cartoonists at the time that were just coming up, and like I worked directly with them and kind of like learned their process and like kind of figured out how to best produce that stuff using really terrible photocopiers. So.
Mm-hmm. So this was at Vermont in that like kind of smaller print shop you were doing all this stuff?
Yeah, it was a place called Anything Printed, and it was really it was anything. Like, it really was anything. You know, it was all sorts of stuff coming through there, and that was like my side hustle. That like the shop owner there was super nice. He's like, yeah, you know, just like pay me to whatever clicks you're using, in your own time,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. You can print these like silly little comic books, but that definitely got me through some really rough months. Like I was actually like making money off of printing mini comics, which is insane. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, for a little bit, like, and I was saying we were also doing screen printing at the time. That was kind of our thing. Is like we can print your mini comic, but we can also do really weird things. Like we were doing these multicolored screen printed covers, but they would also be folded and assembled to look like perfect bound books and stuff like that, and we were kind of getting attention from these micro publishers that were popping up at the time looking for really niche kind of kind of printing. Um, and then we eventually like the screen printed thing that kind of died down, and risograph printing became really popular, and we got our hands on a risograph, but like we just learned a lot. Like if there's no money sink like a risograph. Like if you want to print a risograph zine, buy yourself a risograph and just do it yourself. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are some places that can do it, but it's really expensive because there's a lot of waste involved. It's really closer to like block printing or something. Like you need to be happy with the results you're getting personally. Like it's hard to rely on somebody else's like level of quality because there's so much variance in it. And that was like a really tough lesson to learn as a printer. It's like risograph is really cool, but I cannot control the consistency whatsoever. Like I can give people advice, but like a lot of it comes down to like, yeah, you should redraw this. Like it's just not going to work. Like the registration is never going to work. You should be looser with the way you're designing. And like that's just not good. That's not what you want to hear from a printer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just for those that aren't familiar, a risograph is like a smaller machine, right? It's kind of akin to screen printing, but it's slightly different, right? It's like kind of almost like one-offs in a way.
Yeah. So the way a risograph works is there's like a cylinder in the machine that has ink on it, and it's always kind of seeping ink out. And how it works is you put your image on the glass, and kind of like a photocopier, it scans it. But instead of just immediately making photocopies, it actually has to etch that image of what it scanned onto a wax sheet that gets wrapped around that cylinder, in which they call it a master. And so then when you start printing, you're only printing one side of one page at a time. So after you print one side, you got to make a new master and do the other side, and so on and so forth. And then you have to collate it all and put it together. It's a lot of work for cheap color printing. And that's the allure of it. It's like you can print, a color for very little money in comparison to digital or offset. But the other side of that is there's a lot of work into collating these books together, and also a lot of work in quality control and consistency. So if you are hiring someone to print risograph for you, it can get really costly really quickly because that's a lot of labor. But if that's something you don't mind doing, then you might want to make that $1,200 investment in one of these risograph printers and just have it in your studio and print off zines and use your own time to collate and put it all together. But I'd say, unless you're, like working for like a professional design studio that doesn't mind throwing thousands of dollars away on a print run for like some vanity risograph book, you're best off just trying to find one of these machines yourself and printing everything yourself.
Yeah. I know a lot of people that have, or not a lot, but I know a few people that have risographs and have used that process. And because it's so like finicky and it's more aligned with, like you were saying, like block printing, like printmaking as a process, Like, that's one of those things that practically, yeah, it may not suit you, but if you love the process of making prints, and that's something that might fascinate you, right? Is that?
Yeah, and it's so fast in comparison to any of those other processes. So especially if you're like really just experimenting with stuff, like it's a really good like rough draft for like building up your chops as a screen printer or a block printer. Like you're really speeding up that process of producing those stencils really quickly and really cheaply. So like it's really good to like build up your chops for the for those more difficult time consuming processes like screen printing.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. All right, so then from there, that small print shop, you transitioned to where you are now in printer, or was there another?
Oh, there's still more. There's still
Yeah,
more. It's been a
yeah, yeah,
decade. Yeah.
yeah.
So after that, like I moved to Minnesota with my wife. She attended like a writing program, writing master's program here in Minnesota. And I took a job as an offset printer um, at like a local plant. And it was like the worst job I'd ever had. But I was like, I need to learn offset. Like I've done everything, but like my offset is like limited. Like this is going to be really helpful to learn it. And it was hell. Like it was like 6 months of like printing business card impressions. It was the most boring shit you could imagine. Like I was on the lowest rung of like offset printer. So like what they would do is I was the, I would print the black impressions on the business card. So somebody else would print all of the business cards with all the color graphics or whatever. I was just printing the names, the addresses, just that last pass of black that they do. It was super boring shit. And on top of that, like, it was a really miserable place to work. They didn't really take care of their equipment. So, like, it was really hard to tell. I was like, do I suck at printing? Is it my press? I don't know. It was, no one ever really properly trained me. Like I constantly was getting my like ink rags caught in the rollers of the press and pissing people off. It was a mess. It was a real mess. After about 6 months or so, I was like miserable. Like I didn't even have a car. I had no way of getting this job. I was like waking up at 4 in the morning and like walking for 2 hours to show up to this shop and just get my ass kicked 10 hours a day. And then I'd have to come in on Saturdays, mandatory overtime. It was miserable. I had no time to draw. I was just like at my fucking wits end. And then like a position opened up at this place where it's like pre-press. And it's like, okay, I can sit at a computer. That's fine. And like, I can kind of like, I just kind of faked my way into it. Like I've done pre-press sort of, like I've worked at all these other print shops. I understand how print files work. So like, I like kind of shipped it in there. I was like, oh yeah, I can do pre-press. It's totally fine. Like I've used InDesign. I've used Photoshop. I've used, Illustrator. And I kind of like talked my way into doing pre-press stuff at this really terrible print shop. And then I just like learned more about like the mechanics of offset through doing digital stuff, through doing the pre-press of preparing people's files. I mean, like, it's kind of like a hidden, it's like one of those jobs that like nobody knows exists. Like pre-flight and pre-press is like a thing that like you just don't think about. It's like, well, I'm sending my files to a printer and they're going to print my finished files. It's like, well, no, there's actually this whole other process of somebody needs to look at those files and prepare them to actually go on the press for whatever process you're using. And they might be, you'd be surprised how much adjustment goes into your file once it hits pre-flight. It's like, well, they don't have bleeds, or they're using the wrong size template, or this image isn't the right resolution, or they rasterize their font, or this font is corrupt, but we have like an identical one. There's a lot of weird shit that can happen behind the scenes, and like I learned about that. So then after all of that for a few years in Mankato, Minnesota, where I was at, we eventually, my wife graduated from this master's program and moved to Minneapolis. And then once I got to Minneapolis, I found this place where I'm at now called Bookmobile. And they were a digital printer, meaning everything's like toner based printing, kind of like Xerox's, but fancier. But they were doing print on demand for like small press lit. And it's like, holy shit, this is like the professional version of what I was trying to do when I first started, when I was contracting all this stuff out for these mini comics people, like really small runs for like small press people. And I found a place that was doing that. I mean, in the literary world and the poetry world, but like, I was like, that's the model. That's what I wanted to do. So like, it just synced up really well. And that's where I'm at. So I've been here for almost 4 years now. And my job here is I'm a print rep. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm supposed to be like a salesperson. I'm a terrible salesperson. Like I will talk you out of anything. Like I don't, but at the same time, like if I think something's a good idea, I'll talk you into it. But I'm like, oh yeah, like someone's like, I had like I recently had a customer that was like, I have this book, it's like gold themed. Can you like print with gold ink? And I was like, well, we can't print with gold ink, but you know what we can do. We haven't done it before, but I know we can do it. We can get metallic paper. If you print like a brown color, it'll look like gold. And I talked them into it, and I was like, oh my god, I just like convinced these people to do this, and it worked. And like we printed it, and I was like, this was all theoretical, like just from my like experience with print. I'm like, this should work. And then I was like, what if it doesn't work, dum dum? But it did work. It looked great, but it was like, so that's my job now. It's like trying to find solutions for people to like kind of like print whatever their weird book is. So that's where I'm at now.
That's cool. That's really cool. So with working with a printer to print your work, or with printing, comics work in particular, is there a print process that's better than the other for comics? Is it a matter of just opinion? What is your like? Is offset printing the way to go, or?
Right. Well, I mean, offset's definitely the most flexible in terms of like, you can offset print anything and it'll look good if you use the right printer. Like it's just a matter of finding someone that's doing a good job. So the consistency of and quality of offset's always going to be really high. But like the downside of that is like unless you're printing 500 or more copies, it's just they're probably not even going to want to talk to you. And even after you hit like a 500 or 1,000 copies, like it's still really expensive. So I think digital printing is like a good in between, but there are limitations. And like whatever type of printing you go with, it's good to just kind of learn about what those limitations are before you even begin to kind of like design your book, if that makes sense. So, kind of like I was saying about like risograph earlier with this type of printing, which has like a lot of registration issues. Like, I used to tell people, I'm like, well, don't have like colors butt up against each other too much because it's never going to look right. They're going to overlap, and like a good solution to something like that is like, if you ever seen those zines that like John Pham does, this book called Epoxy, the way he draws is he draws with like kind of airbrushy gradients. So even if the colors are like misregistered, like it doesn't matter because everything's fuzzy, so like it still looks good, and like so that's like how that artist is working with risograph to get good results. And I think the same thing's true with digital printing. Like let me copy here. So this is like the newest thing that I just off the presses last week, Rust Belt Review, which is kind of like a comics lit mag that I've put together. There are certain things that like I know that our printers can do well and digital printers can do well, and there are certain things that can't. So like for instance, like this back cover is like a textured orange, right? And like I went with like I wanted a large field of a color, but I know that when you're dealing with a digital printer, trying to get a consistent area of color is really difficult. As soon as you have a large flat area of color, you're going to start seeing what they call banding, which is just like these like ripples and patterns that show up on the printed piece itself because the drums and the copiers have a tough time keeping a consistent temperature when dealing with an area that large. So if you're dealing with just a single color, our eyes can pick up patterns really quickly. So we see these things called banding, which is like literally the drum just not able to keep a consistent temperature when fusing tone around the paper. So the workaround with that is like use a texture. So like when you're using a large area of color, put a texture behind it, give it just a little bit of inconsistency, a little bit of static. And what that does is it allows the eye to not pick up on those patterns because there's this whole other mess of static happening. So technically on that back image there with that large area of color, there probably is some banding, but because there's so much static of like this texture going on with the color, you don't see it. So like that's kind of how you work around that problem with digital printing. And since I like work at this place, like I know what our limitations are. I had someone that was contributing a piece that had like this, I always call it the kiss of death. These like large gray areas, right? You see this like, and actually like I found the right percentage of gray where it wouldn't be a banding issue, but like whenever I get someone that sends me a file that has like a large gray area, it's just like, here's a big gray block. I'm like, that's gonna look like shit. Like every single time. It's a kiss of death. Digital printers, copiers, they can't do a really good job of it. We printed a book for Wayne Coyne from Flaming Lips, and I was so excited. And then when we got his files, I saw all of his pages with text of these large gray areas. And I was like, oh, this is gonna suck. And it's Wayne Coyne from the Flaming Lips. And it's not my business to tell him how to make his book. And he was fine with it, but it was just like, oh man, like kiss of death, Wayne, kiss of death.
So did you actually you just went with the files he sent? You didn't kind of adjust those, or?
But he got proofs, and it had, okay. Like my role is kind of like, I put something in front of the customer. If they make a comment, they're like, I don't like how this looks. Then I'll address the issue and try and find a solution. But like, it's really tough because like I can look at anything that anybody prints and I can tell you what I think is wrong with it. But like that's like if I did that, nothing would ever get printed. I'd look at something and say it's too dark, or there's banding, or you're doing like a knockout font on a light color. It's not going to read really well, or this spine's too thin to even put text on. But like that's not my place, like that's all like aesthetic. But if someone says to me like, I can't really read this text that's on this black area, I can say, well, you need to use a thicker font. You need to use something that doesn't have serifs, right? Like then I can give that advice. But it's always kind of like I'm waiting for feedback. So I think if you're working with a printer and you're not happy with something, give them feedback, because they might be able to give you some sort of solution to what that problem is. But a lot of times they're probably holding back on stuff that technically is printed correctly and within spec of their printer, but they're kind of waiting for the customer to give them some feedback. So if you are working with a printer, never feel bad about asking questions or asking for feedback, because the more communication you have with your printer, the better job they can do to make sure they're meeting your expectations, because they don't want to get another email from you a month later saying, I got my books and they suck. The next time, the only other email they're ever going to want to see from you is like them saying, I want to reprint. Like otherwise, like, that's just how it goes. So
that's some good advice there, though. I think that's one thing we forget is that, we are, if we're working with a printer, and also it goes along the same lines as like, if you're working with like a web hosting site or so forth, these people are working for you. And as such, you guys, like, they're there to support the project as far as like making sure that you're happy with the book, the prints, the website, and all that stuff. I think that's some really spot on advice as far as what just getting the proof is not just like the end. It's about kind of a process, back and forth conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's great. And along that line, like with the pre-press stage, what are some things like maybe like top three, I don't know if you have a lot of, but what are like some best pieces of advice you can give to artists when they are sending working with a printer, I guess, in general. Yeah.
My number one piece of advice is to just, whatever you're sending to a printer, print it off and look at it from your home printer or from a copier or something. Because you'd be surprised, like once the context of looking at something on a screen has been taken away and you're looking at it in print, you're going to find typos really quickly. It's like that advice that you give to people drawing, where you say like, look at the drawing in a mirror, great, fresh set of eyes. Same thing with printing something off. If you print something off, like you're going to see those weird quirks immediately, and you're going to save yourself a ton of time and money by simply just printing it off somewhere and catching those really small little fixes before sending your file to even get approved. So I'd say that's like my biggest piece of advice is like, just print it off and look at it with a fresh set of eyes. Like just simply having something in print, it makes all the difference in the world. So that's number one. Number two, like include bleeds. Like you'd be surprised. Like everyone's like, oh, of course, obviously include bleeds with your files. Really look at your file before you send it. Because depending on what printer you're working with, they might, like the old place I worked at, if someone didn't send me bleeds, like we were a shitty shop. So you know what they told me? They said, just blow it up, make it work. Don't waste time talking to the customer, blow it up, make it work. And that could suck. for someone, you might not be expecting that. And like sometimes like the printer just won't tell you. It's like, well, I can fix it here. So like try to include bleeds to whatever your printer is specifying. Usually it's like an eighth of an inch around all four edges of however they want the files formatted. But if you go on to your printer's website, they're probably going to have a page that has information on what they want from you. So like review that information and really, after you export your file and it's ready to go, like print it off, take a look at the file itself, make sure everything like passes the sniff test before you pass it on. Because like I said, like some printers, I've worked for them, they suck. They're just going to print it, and a good printer will tell you. I work for a good printer, I tell you, but that's not always the case.
That's really good advice too. And I like that feedback. That first one I think is super important. Like, and while the quality might be different, like you said, that's just another chance for you to look at it in a different format, and as such, your brain process the work differently.
Yeah.
I think that's really smart. In a different way to maybe tackle the same question, but maybe I don't know. We'll go with it anyway. But what are some never do's? What should you never do when working with a printer?
Yeah, I would say if you have a color sensitive image and you've never worked with a printer before, always look at hard copy proofs. Don't ever just like opt for electronic proofs or just go, say okay to go to press, because every printer is a little bit different. Like literally every single press has a different gamut of color it can produce. So even if it's like, oh, I've printed this in color before, it looked great, I'm using a new printer, get a proof, take a look at it, because odds are it's going to look different and it might not meet your expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had a question as well. I feel like as cartoonists, if we're printing our work, we're obviously printing it for some end goal in mind, whether that's taking it to our local comic book shops or bringing it to a convention. And so as such, time frame is to when we're sending books off to the printer, and shipping and all that stuff is a factor, so that we can get the books in a timely manner, that we can have them ready for the show or whatever. Is there kind of a typical or standard time frame? Is everything a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean,
Things?
especially right now, things are really wacky, right? Like
Yeah.
everything is just really slow, and it's because any supply chain you can imagine is being slowed down randomly, right? Could simply just be like, there's an outbreak at this paper plant in Wisconsin, so we can't get this paper, so that's going to delay the order by a week or whatever.
Mhm.
And we're really good about catching that stuff ahead of time, but we also have been giving ourselves more buffer. That being said, I'd say probably most printers you're dealing with, if you're doing something like digital printed, you're probably looking at about 2 weeks for printing, more or less. A better printer will take a little bit more time. If someone's like, we're going to print this and have it be in 48 hours, ask for a proof first. Because you might be dealing with a place that doesn't care too much about quality. But digital, like a good digital printer, you're looking at 2 to 3 weeks right now. Offset printing, depending on what you're doing, if you're doing like a paperback book, like an offset printer might be able to turn around in about a month or so. If you're doing something that's a little more elaborate, something maybe hardcover or something that's like a foil stamp on it or an emboss or a die stamp or something strange, it's going to be a couple months. Now, if you're printing overseas, you're looking at a couple of months for printing, but you're also looking at, like a month for shipping, because that stuff's got to go over the ocean. So that takes time. So that's kind of like the general progression. I would say, in your early phases of working with a printer and self-publishing and doing this kind of stuff, give yourself more buffer than you think you need, because there's always going to be really strange hiccups and things you just didn't factor in. And on top of that, like factor in shipping. Like when you're working with a printer and you're not picking it up directly, books are heavy, and the shipping is going to be a big part of the cost. So if you get a print quote from somebody and it's like, oh great, that's $400, I can do that, and then the order's done and it's ready to ship and it's $700. Like, yeah, there were ship costs, there's setup costs. You sent revised files, you change your page count. Like, really be on top of that. Make sure when you're sending your files that everything is ready, everything matches your quote, and that you know how much shipping is going to cost. Because shipping is always that like secret cost that like isn't really included on quotes because it's an additional information that your rep needs. They need to know where something's shipping to tell you. But it would be obviously really awkward from them to send a quote without shipping to say like, by the way, shipping's really expensive, because as a printer, we assume we're working with people that understand that shipping books is expensive, but it does catch people off guard, you know, especially since we live in the age of Amazon where like everything's free shipping. The idea of like, wait, I have to pay for you to ship something? It's like, yes, books are heavy. I just had a customer that they printed they printed 500 pounds worth of books. You know, like and well, I'm saying pounds because we're talking about shipping, so like that's the important information. 500 pounds of books, and you know, he got the ship amount, and he's like, "Well, it's really expensive to ship those. Like, I calculated you should be able to fit all those books into a single 24-inch by 24-inch box." And it's like, there's no cardboard box that's going to hold 500 pounds worth of books.
Yeah.
That's not happening. Also, like UPS won't even pick up a 500. They're not going to pick up a refrigerator box full of books and ship it, my man. Like, so like I saw that job being prepared to ship the other day, and I just like laughed to myself because like I saw the books in person, and I was like, he wanted those all in one box.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Be kind to the postal workers. That's for sure. Oh my gosh. That is, you know, that is bringing me back to my days at Dark Horse working in sales and kind of figuring out like what could actually fit into a box and everything like that. There was one time I do remember a client very adamantly demanding like books be shipped in a certain amount of boxes, and
That's the
like,
worst.
yeah, we had to get our shipping team involved, and like it was a slow talk down, but I think we gave them an extra discount on the next order.
Nice. Yeah. I had somebody that told me that, you know, they're like, I can't, if the boxes have to be under 20 pounds and the books have to be shrink wrapped in multiples of 5. So that worked out. We could only put five books in each box. So like we sent him like 100 boxes, and he like sent me this angry email. It's like, what is this? Some sort of joke? And it's just like, those are the parameters.
Yeah. Please see attached email. Oh my gosh, that is nuts.
Yeah.
But it's always exciting too when you're working on that angle with clients and everything like that. There's always something that crops up like that keeps things exciting. All right. So I kind of want to, unless is there anything about like, you know, the printing, working for a printer, that anything that we might not have covered that you want to like kind of share with us before we turn the corner?
I don't think so. Like I said, like if do your research with any printer that you're looking at online. Like I said, like if someone's telling you we can turn something around in 48 hours and it's going to be cheap, you know, just kind of ask for samples, ask for proofs. Any decent printer will send you samples of paper. They'll send you printed samples to see if that's what you're looking for. Especially if it's a shop that's like, you know, out of state or outside of the country. Really, like take a look at those samples and see if that's really what you're looking for before you settle in with that printer.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right, so I did want to spend a little bit of time, and you shared with us a proof of it earlier, but I'd like to talk a little bit about your new anthology, Rust Belt Review.
Yeah.
This is the and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first your own anthology. You've been part of an anthology before, but this is the first one you're doing solo, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So, you know, back in the day, you know, me, Andrew Greenstone, and Alex Bullitt, we were kind of like this, you know, we were like a collective, right? Like we kind of all worked on it together and made all those decisions together and did all that stuff. And I was actually pretty hands off with it because I was like working full time at a pharmacy, right? So it's like I didn't have too much of an experience with that. But you know, as the years have gone on, like I've done all sorts of different types of publishing. You know, like I've self-published my comics. I've used distributors. I had a collection of my mini comics published by Secret Acres as a book that was marketed towards the book trade. So I've seen like a lot of different angles for how I could present my work, and like there are things I like about all of them, but there are things that like kind of I don't like about all of them. So I kind of like in a way like backwards engineered what I wanted, and it ended up being the thing I started with, which is an anthology, which is kind of funny. But as, you know, like the goal of the anthology is like I wanted to create a venue for cartoonists to present like alternative work that you don't see very often in the publishing world, um, but on a somewhat regular basis, right? Like, so I think like if you're like an alternative cartoonist, making kind of like more artier, kind of like slice of life, or anything that's like not going to sell money, like the only places that are going to publish you are places that want books, and books take a long, 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 long time, right? Like, you know, like my first graphic novel, Killbuck, that took me 3 years. You know, and I was gone. I was off the fucking map, working on this book, and that sucks. Like, I think a big part of the comics scene is like the community and like talking to other people and sharing your work and looking at other people's work and getting excited about it. And like in the world of independent comics where there isn't a lot of money, like that's one of the rewards of independent comics is, you know, talking to other cartoonists, talking to your readers on a regular basis. Like that's really nice. Um, so I know a bunch of cartoonists that like they're making good work. Um, and especially right now because of the pandemic, like they can't really share it for either, you know, reasons of like it's going to be published later as a whole book, or you know I can't go to a show, or any of these other reasons. You know, they can't really share their work. Like it's not, you know, like it's tough to like put up a page of like this arty thing onto Instagram, one page at a time or something. Like it just doesn't work. You know, so I wanted to create a venue for people to make these kind of short story comics that are like 8 to 12 pages long. They're either serialized or one off, but like in a space that's really flexible. So like that's what I was thinking about with this book here. So like I went with a really large size because I wanted to give people a lot of range. You know, like the size itself is like it's a wider rectangle. So like I have people in here that are doing like thinner stuff and people are doing wider stuff. So like even like when it came down to format, like I wanted to offer something for everybody. And like worst case scenario, if you're like, oh, ultimately this thing that I'm working on, it'll probably be published at a smaller size. Like it never hurts to print it larger anyway. Just, you know, maybe you end up liking it and go that way anyway. But so I just wanted to provide a venue that kind of worked for everybody as much as possible. Like what I was thinking with this is like that idea that you hear from typographers a lot, where they say like, well, a font is supposed to deliver information you're not supposed to notice. And that's like what I feel like with this book in general. Like I want this book to be just a vehicle for like reading alternative comics, but like it's never like, whoa, it's the new Kramer Zergot, or it's this book with this crazy cover, or, you know, like it's all themed. It's all about like people that own horses and murder people. You know, like no, it's just like it's a really simple venue. It's just a 9x12 magazine full of comics that are either serialized or one-off. The list of contributors is on the back. You know, the pages are numbered. Every page tells you who the author is and what the story is. Like it's really, really, really just trying to focus on trying to create this space for people to just put their work out there and let the work speak for itself.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And you know, like I think as you're talking about the format is exciting though. That is a 9x12 book. I mean, that's not super common. I mean, on the bookshelf behind me, I've got all sorts of different sizes, but that's relatively an exciting size for comics.
Yeah, I think so. Like it's a little bit outside of that. If you're self-publishing comics, like pretty much the largest you're ever going to really get to is 8.5 by 11. Unless you start working with printers, right? Like that's just any standard photocopier. Like 11 by 17 is the largest sheet of paper you can probably run through there. So 8.5 by 11 is probably the largest you're working at. So I am, with the magazine, I am offering just a little bit more space for people, so it's a little more exciting. And I think it does make a difference having that extra space. But those are like the kind of comics I really love the most, or like they feel the most comic-y to me. Is like if I can open up a book and the entire comic that I'm looking at takes up my periph, like that's what I'm looking for. Like it's comics time, baby. Like left to right, the whole thing. I'm not seeing my gross thumbs. I'm not seeing my cat staring at me. Like I'm just seeing comics, right? Like, And I think that's really satisfying. Like there's something, there's something really personal about a small book. Like I've done like that was my thing for a long time. These small little comics, little 5.5, 8.5 little booklets. And it's like it's very personal, it's a little intimate conversation. I was like, no, this time around, like I want to and I want the reader to be completely enveloped in comics. Like I want them to just have to take it all in. Like I want them to have to move their head when they're reading the comic, Like I think there's something really special about that experience. And like some of my favorite comics are kind of that size, like um, uh, Death Ray, Dan Clowes, that comic he did. It's 9 by 12. And it's a really satisfying read. It's only like 24 pages long, but it's so good, and like you can just read it over and over again, and it's just so satisfying. And then like the same thing goes for like David Mazzucchelli had this like anthology in the 90s called Rubber Blanket. And it's the same idea, like 9 by 12. And it's just like allows that flexibility for artists to kind of like either play with that space or at the very least like just resign to the fact that it's larger than they would like. Um, it's just really flexible. And I think like doing that too is really just, at least in my own experience of reading something that large, it really is like it takes. It's just the fact that you're dealing with so much real estate in front of you. Like it really does like allow you just to concentrate on the comics and think about them, um, uh, while still being able to fit in your backpack. It's not like one of those Sunday books where like it's taking up your table and all that stuff. Like it's still a reasonable size. You throw it, throw it in your backpack. You take it. You can read it on a plane if you really want to. Like um, it's just a really satisfying size.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. And you had mentioned like, so is this going to be kind of a quarterly? Is this going to
Yeah,
be
yeah. So this is it's quarterly. I haven't I feel like the ultimate curse for any kind of like journal
yeah?
or something is to like be like, and it's quarterly, because then it's like, nope, that means it's coming out once every 18 months.
I know I hesitated to ask, but I did want to just check it.
Yeah,
See,
yeah. So
yeah.
that's kind of is like the initial run of cartoonists I'm working with. Like we all like made a pact, It's like we're doing this. So I'm serializing my next graphic novel in here. Andrew Greenstone, who I had mentioned earlier, he's serializing his graphic novel in here. I have a couple of other cartoonists that are serializing um, like larger comics that might be graphic novel, might not be. But then I also have some one-off stuff. So just to mix it up, because of course, like the one thing that's really tough with serializing your work is like, well, issue one's going to sell really well, and it's going to go down from there because people are like, well, I'm interested in this artist, but I don't want to pay $40 to read the story. I'll just wait till it's collected or whatever, right? So there are comics in there too that are like one-off kind of comics, and the plan in the future too is to include writing about comics. Like critical reviews, interviews. Also, like I'm putting together kind of like a print guide. Like I don't know if do you remember that Jordan Crane had this like guide to print reproduction mini comic that like it was photocopied to death. But I remember David Duncan had it, and he like handed it to everyone that was in that mini comics class. And it was just a zine like from like comics people being like, here's how you steal copies from IKEA, like kind of that kind of stuff. And it's like it's not really relevant anymore. There's some good stuff in there, but like it's been 20 years. Like David Cho talking about ripping off a printer at Kinko's just doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, the technology's changed.
Yeah, tech has changed, but like there's some good information there. So like I'm doing this kind of like spiritual sequel to that where it's like I'm gonna explain like how to just here's some like basic fundamentals for printing and like how to do that. And like because with the magazine I want it to also be a resource for cartoonists, like not only just a venue for work, but also like if you are a cartoonist, like aside from like seeing some comics you might be interested in, there's like valuable information either in forms of like some like industry talk, like talking about printing, or like look at like a critical overview of a specific cartoonist's career, or an interview with a specific cartoonist or somebody in the industry. Like I want the magazine to be something that you can pick up and read and put down, and then like 9 months from now you're like, actually I am kind of interested in like maybe doing like a lithograph print. I think there's like an article about that, and then pick it up again. Like having this like ongoing value of this like this object in that kind of way. And even being like a time capsule, like I said, with with the book that Jordan Crane put together like 20 years ago, like it's not really relevant information, but it's kind of cute to read still, if that's the thing you're interested in. So like I wanted to kind of have that value too of like just kind of being like a time capsule of the moment, but also a resource in the venue.
Mhm. I think that's great. I think that's cool to kind of hear that evolution. I'm always a fan of kind of anything that is kind of educational and resourceful, but also entertaining as well.
Yeah.
I think that's great. Um, we're coming down to the end of our time today. So what I'd like to do is open it to Q&As from the group. Now, how we're going to handle this is you're going to enter your cue, you're going to enter your question into the chat, and then we will decide whether it is worthy enough to be asked, just so everyone's not talking over each other and everything like that. While you guys are formulating your cues, Sean, I didn't prep you for this, but we're going to do a lightning round of questions real quick.
All right.
All right. So you had mentioned you have got a cat. What is your cat's name?
Velvet.
Velvet.
Yeah, he's a black cat, black velvet.
Nice.
Yeah.
And is Velvet nice, or is Velvet a?
Oh, he's the nicest cat of all time. The only time he's not been nice is that we actually just adopted a dog in October, and like he kind of like herds the dog onto the couch. Like if the dog gets off the couch, he's like, no man, like you go out, you live on the couch. The rest of this is like Velvet territory. So it's been interesting to see him like become this cranky old man that's like, get off my lawn. But otherwise, he's the sweetest cat of all time. Like I'll pick him up, I'll rub his belly, and he'll just like purr. He's just like, he just loves attention. He's just like a little attention blanket. But now that he's got like a little sister, he's a little tyrant sometimes.
Yeah, well, you gotta put the dog in the place for sure. Let's see. Lightning round question number 2. What is your favorite comic? If this is hard to answer, what is the last comic you read?
Favorite comic? Yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be. I think it's between two. I have the two that I go back to a lot is Big Man by David Mazzucchelli, which was originally printed in Rubber Blankets #3. It's kind of hard to find, but it's like an amazing short story about like this like giant monster man that ends up in like a farm family's barn, and they're like taking care of him, and like it's very helpful, but the townspeople around him treat him as a monster, and things go sideways. It's a really beautiful short story. It's really satisfying. It's like 40 pages long. It's like, in my opinion, the perfect comic. The other perfect comic was one that like left an impression on me very, very early on, which was Beast Mother by Eleanor Davis, which is like another perfect like.
Oh wow.
That's probably maybe like a 20-page comic, but it's almost kind of like a similar theme. Maybe there's something about like being like a big person that makes me think like, oh, I'm this monster that I'm really sensitive, but maybe people think I'm a monster. I don't know. But it's kind of a similar theme as Big Man of like this monster in the woods that's like, in a way, like she's like kidnapping children, but then she's like taking care of them, and they like hire this hunter to like hunt down this monster. And there's this moment where like there's like humanity that's being recognized with this like creature that's like kidnapped these children. And it's like a beautiful mini comic, right? Do you remember that one? Like it has like
I've got it.
covers, screen printed. And it's like it's one of those things where I'm like, whenever like someone like talks about Eleanor Davis now, I'm like, oh man, I love Eleanor Davis. I'm like, I gotta show you some shit because
Yeah,
you don't even know.
Because that thing was kind of my first experience with like, oh, like mini comics. Yeah, definitely a cheap way to put yourself out there. It was like mini comics as an art form. That's like an example of like that thing has like 2.5 covers on it. Like with the fold over and everything. Like, that's one that I do show to. Occasionally, I'll teach a mini comics class. That's definitely one that I bring in. Just it was kind of just like, what? Like, there's 2 covers on this thing. This is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, like, if it's Eleanor Davis, she can do 1 million covers. It's fine. They're all good. They're all going to be amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And let's see. last lightning round, and then we'll get to the question. Are you streaming any television right now, or what's the last thing of quality that you streamed on?
Last thing, I don't stream quality. I only stream garbage. But you know what? What's been put back onto streaming that I love is, and I've seen it so many times, but every time it's a treat. It's Freaks and Geeks.
Oh
It's
yeah,
back on Hulu, and
that's
like
awesome.
I love that show. Like I love when you can tell by the writing that the writers love and care about those characters, even if they're like the most obnoxious little shit ever. Like there's just something so heartwarming to me about like seeing that kind of care put into these like fictional characters. You know, I think that's a beautiful show, and it's also really funny to like see all these people that like they're all like in their like mid 40s now, but they're all it's like they used to be children.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The older sister, the main sister in that, it's been in a lot of stuff recently, and every time I see her, I'm like, oh, Freaks and Geeks.
Yeah, she was doing like a lot of voice acting, I think, for a while, and then she was like I think she was like in like the last season of Batman or the second to last season, and then she's been in a lot of stuff since then.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And also like I love Bill from that show, which the actor that plays Bill ended up being somebody on the Silicon Valley TV show.
Yeah.
And I love that actor so much, and his performances are always so deadpan and so funny, but also like so sincere.
Yeah.
It's such a good. Bill is probably my favorite character on that show. Just like this dorky, awkward, gross teenager, but it's just like the softest boy of all time.
Right. No, he's great. All right, let's. Kelsey has two questions. I think they're worthy of being asked. First one is, I've fallen under the sway under risograph. Is there any method I could try at home to replicate a similar style of printing? Would that be block printing or what?
Oh, it's a good question. There are some different things you could try. One thing you could try that I used to do this when I worked at Staples is you can print one color at a time, even on a color printer. So if you have like a home printer that's like a color printer, try printing just one color at a time. Like you're like this, I'm printing my blue on the sheet, and then run it through again. You're going to get some misregistration, which is kind of like the beauty of risograph printing. But laying ink on top of itself is going to create some interesting effects that are pretty similar to risograph. So I'd say, like, if you've got a color printer, try doing one color at a time. Another thing you can try, a really quick solution is if you can screen print at home. I'm not sure if you can, but one thing you can do is you can always print just like a single color onto your sheet of paper and then run it through your black and white. If you have a laser printer, you can run black and white on top of it. That would be fine. Just make sure your prints are dry. But that's like a really cool, quick. It's also a really interesting effect of like black toner on like color ink. It has like an interesting look. It's pretty unique. So if you're interested in kind of that process of risograph, but you don't have access to one, I would definitely try either screen printing a portion and then running it through your printer, or just printing one color at a time. Or even if you're working with a black and white printer, you can try printing one tone of gray, because even when you're building up toner on top of toner, it starts to do some interesting effects. It's not always going to be exactly like risograph. It's going to be something completely different, but like the process is going to be pretty similar, and I feel like it scratches a similar itch. If you're looking specifically just for the aesthetics of risographs, there are like some really good texture packs you can like buy for that do a pretty good job. There's a site called True Grit Texture Supply that has some really good like authentic print textures, and they have some really good distress patterns and stuff you can use, and distress brushes that can kind of really ape that kind of aesthetic. So what you can do is you kind of make a digital version of what you want that risograph image to look like, and then you can just print it off on a digital printer, and it'll, for the most part, look like that. So
that's awesome. That's really cool. I have heard of printing a single color at a time, and I'm meaning to try that. But that's really cool. The other question Kelsey has is, if I'm self-publishing a comic, what is the best advice for achieving a good print?
Okay, so I'm assuming this is like printing yourself too. I'm going to make that assumption, right? Is that right, Kelsey, or are you working
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
print?
that's right. Hi, I'm Kelsey.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're printing it yourself, the best print, I would say, like, are you working with like line art, or are you working with like patterns or textures, or what are you doing?
Inked comics is usually what I do.
Yeah,
I've done
okay.
a lot. I've printed in black and white
Like
before,
solid
but
black line art, that kind of thing.
yeah, but
Okay.
I'm also experimenting with color. So just
Okay.
really any
Yeah.
good advice.
Yes. Yeah. So with black line art, like the best thing to do is like to make a bitmap TIFF of your line art at like minimum 600 DPI. So what this is going to do is your artwork's going to look kind of jagged on the computer screen, but if you have your image at least 600 DPI, it's going to print pretty solid. The next thing you want to make sure you're doing is with whatever printer you're working with at home, make sure you have all your downsampling turned off. Turn everything off that's going to resample that image, because what it's going to do is it's going to break that black line into kind of gray areas. And those gray areas are going to turn into halftone patterns. So your solid black line is eventually just going to have these little jagged edges on the edge of it. So you want to make sure you're turning off any kind of resampling of any kind whatsoever. If you're using InDesign, it's actually default that resamples artwork that's higher than 300 DPI when you're using the export settings. So make sure that's shut off. And so once you've exported your file with InDesign or whatever program you're using as a PDF, open up that PDF and just zoom in as much as you can. Make sure that that black line art is jagged. There's no gray on it. If that's the case, then your file is going to be ready to print. So then once you're printing the thing, just make sure whatever printer you're using, you have it set to its highest resolution settings. And even still then, since you're working with a bitmap image, it should print pretty quickly because it's going to be a low file size. A bitmap TIFF doesn't take up much space at all. Like my first graphic novel, Killbuck, was all bitmap TIFFs layered on top of each other. And it was like 80 megabytes total. So if you do that, you should be able to get a pretty decent impression. And with color, 300 DPI is preferable, but the way I've always done it that I've been happy with is like, I always have my color layer separate from my line art layer in InDesign. So my line art's always 600 DPI, but I'll work with color at 300 DPI and layer it underneath the line art. So then when I export the file with all the settings turned off, I'm still getting that really nice 600 DPI black line, but I'm also getting, per spec, the 300 DPI color artwork, but my file's not going to be gigantic because most of the hard work is at 300 DPI. It's just keeping that line art crisp. So
nice, very good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
All right, excellent. Well, let's see. Oh, last minute addition, and this will be the last one, and we'll call over. How does trimming work with working with print?
Oh, okay. You mean like just like final trimming something down? Well, we have like large guillotines, they call them. It's not the cool kind you see in memes. It's just like a large paper cutter that just cuts everything down. And there's a couple ways that's done. If the book is like a weird format, like my book, in terms of being super large, once it's actually all bound, there's like white edges along all the edges. And they actually do a final trim on all three sides here with that guillotine printer, one at a time, trim it down to its final size. If you're working with a more standard size, like a 6x9, we actually have an automated process that goes like, it's like a little conveyor belt, and the books go in there and 3 blades come down at the same time and chop all 3 sides down. So that's how that works. There's also some trimming that happens between your book being bound and the press. So like when you're printing something off a professional press here, multiple pages are being printed on a single sheet. So what needs to happen is those books need to be trimmed before they're even sent to the bindery. So that's the trimming process.
Nice. All right. And Natalia, thank you for the question, but I don't want to, this was scheduled for about an hour, so I don't want to take up any more time of everybody, just so we can maintain our schedules for the week. if what I'll do is I'll email Sean the question, and then he could answer it that way.
Yeah.
And then I'll share it with you as well. But wrapping things up, I want to thank you very much, Sean, for coming in and talking to us
Yeah.
about
Thank you for having me.
our books.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Yeah.
And thank everybody. Thank you, students, for coming in and listening to us talk. This is the first of many videos this week that we're going to be recording that will go up on the Hissy Fit website, hissyfitcomics.com. Make sure that we are sharing that with love, so everybody can, everybody in the Artist Alley can get their work seen this week. But that's all for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and more to come. All right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.